I'm happily sitting here with my friend Hank O'Neill, who has promised he will tell me something about the hard-to-find Edwin Squirrel Ashcraft, who's not well known, but he was involved in everything.
He had his finger in an awful lot of pies. His real name was Edwin Maurice Ashcraft III, better known as Squirrel. And they actually even used a picture of a squirrel on one of the record albums that came out in the early 50s that John Steiner put out. But it was just an accident that I knew Squirrel Ashcraft. He was a longtime jazz fan who launched his jazz-loving career in Chicago in the 20s, and wound up knowing most of the Chicago guys, the white Chicago guys, and went to Princeton in maybe 27 or so, and was a member of the Princeton Triangle Jazz Band and all of that kind of things, and had a career as a lawyer in Chicago. And then in the mid-40s, during the war, he was with the Office of Naval Intelligence, and then towards about 1947-48, he was recruited to be the head of the Chicago office of the Central Intelligence Agency, because at that time the Office of Operations was establishing sort of little beachheads in all the major American cities, and the person that was selected to run those offices was generally a person who, one, didn't need a job, who could buy lunch on their own, someone who was socially acceptable to almost everybody in town and could make a call to whoever, and that fitted Squirrel perfectly. I mean, the Ashcraft and Ashcraft was a major Chicago law firm, and he was the head guy. And from the standpoint of social acceptability, he was, social register kind of guy, and could call anybody. I remember looking at pictures in a scrapbook, and who's that guy? And oh, he was the head of Sears. And who's that guy? And these were people just hanging out at his house. So in any event, he was good at what he did in the Chicago office. And in the early mid-50s, he was brought to Washington to run the Office of Operations for the entire country, and stayed in Washington until he died, which was in the early 80s. I got to know him because, purely by a whole bunch of circumstances far too lengthy and complicated to explain, I wound up in June of 1964 as the junior person in the Office of Operations in Washington, D.C., and had been told when I reported for work, I'd been in the CIA for a year and a half by then, but through another bunch of long and complicated stories, I wound up in the Office of Operations and went over there for my first day. I was told that I was to, my first chore was to go in and introduce myself to the director and say, hello, I'm Hank, blah, 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 stay 5 minutes and leave. So I'm sitting by his secretary, or one of his secretary's desk, and I'm sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting, and people are coming and going, and finally somebody comes out of the office, and it's all, Mr. Ashcraft this and Mr. Ashcraft that, and then finally an older gentleman comes out and says, well, I don't know what we're going to do, but Squirrel wants to do such and such. And I asked the secretary, I said, Ann, is does the director play the piano? And she looked at me and she says, yeah, Christmas carols, you know. He can play the piano and we sing Christmas carols at the Christmas party. I said, oh, okay. So, you see, Squirrel is an unusual name. I've never known anybody else with that name. And so I went in, and instead of saying 5 minutes, I stayed the entire afternoon because I actually had a record he was on and knew who he was from the 20s. And so by that time, 1964, he had stopped most of his musical activities. He was just unknown. I mean, people knew of him, but he had gone into the CIA where you didn't have normal access to the, and he had stopped the musical events that he had at his house virtually every Monday night from the early 30s until when he left Chicago in 1947 or 48. He had stopped all that. And anyway, to make a long story short, I sort of rekindled his interest in maybe playing the piano in front of people, and had this wonderful old Steinway in his apartment, which was tuned, you know, every 3 years, whether it needed it or not. And so we got that back in shape and then started having an occasional party there because he still was in touch with a handful of musicians. He was still in touch with Jimmy McPartland, who was one of his old-time closest pals. He was still in touch with Marion McPartland, plus all of the people from the Princeton Triangle Jazz Band who were still around. They were all in business. None of them were professional musicians. None of them went in that direction. But, and so I would go over to, it was 3900 Watson Place Northwest, and you go into a small room where he kept all of his records and stuff, and an enormous scrapbook, a scrapbook that was about this tall and about that wide. And I mean, here was, you know, every Big Spider Beck Jeanette, and they weren't in really very good condition because he played them to death. He wasn't a collector, he was a music fan and stuff. And so we got to be pals and stuff, and worked on various projects, eventually even putting out some records and having parties and recording them. I mean, the very first thing that I ever recorded that wound up on a record was in the Squirrel Ashcraft living room on his Ampex tape recorder using 2 old beat-up Electro Voice microphones, which were somewhat better than the microphones that he had used to record all the home recordings that he had made in the 40s and in the 30s and into the 40s. He started recording everything, not everything, but many things at his home, probably about 1933 or 4. And it went all the way forward to the last things that were recorded at his house were in the 40s after the war. He had one of the first tape recorders that probably anybody had in Chicago, because he liked to record things, and he was very good friends with John Steiner, who had Paramount Records, but I mean, that wasn't what John really did. John was really a chemist at Northwestern, I think. And so Steiner recorded a lot of the things at Squirrel's house, and then probably convinced him to buy a tape recorder, which in those years, it was so old. I mean, I actually transferred probably, I don't know, 10 or a dozen, I don't know how many rolls, of tape that Squirrel had made in the late 40s. And it was on paper tape, not plastic. It was a piece of paper with some sort of a magnetic coating. And I remember, working on something and the band would be playing and it would be a Jack Teagarden solo or something like that. And all of a sudden I go, the wow and the flutter, the captain had slipped or whatever on the tape recorder that Squirrel had in the late 40s. But there were some nice things on that paper stuff. I still have the acetate versions. I have no idea what happened to the original paper tape. So, but anyway, I just wound up purely by accident being assigned to that division in the CIA in the summer of 64 and staying in that division until October of 76. And I mean, the degree to which Squirrel Ashcraft was involved with music, it's very simple. When I came to New York City in June of 1967, I didn't know a soul here other than at the office. I knew Marion McPartland from Squirrel's House. I knew Jimmy McPartland from Squirrel's House. And I had met, I didn't really know, I had met Eddie Condon at Squirrel's House. But nobody else, not a soul. However, before I arrived, Squirrel made half a dozen judicious phone calls on my behalf. And that meant that when I called John Hammond, come on up. When I called Nestle Erdogan, come on by. That kind of thing. He could call anybody. I mean, the reason that, one of the primary reasons that Eddie Condon got the liquor license for the club was that he could make a call to smooth the gears with whoever had to smooth those gears to have it work out. And I don't know how many, but it was 3 or 4 or 5 musicians that he helped support, his old friends from Chicago when they would get in trouble or something. And but he was deeply, deeply involved in the music scene. First in Chicago with the Chicago Rhythm Club and all of those kind of people. And I mean, he once gave me, everybody talks about the concert at the Congress Hotel where Teddy played. And Squirrel once gave me, he says, here, I've got a couple of these here. And it was a ticket to that concert. So I put it in a little frame and stuff. So anyway, but largely, almost totally forgotten today. But then again, most people are. Even really kind of fancy people get forgotten pretty quickly if they don't have a monument or something like that. But he purposely tried not to be high visibility kind of guy.
Was that temperament and personality, or was that CIA, or both?
Maybe both. I remember one day he had a big apartment. Actually, what he had at 3900 Watson Place, he had 4 apartments in one. He had 4 apartments on that floor. In other words, he could, I mean, one time I took Eddie Condon to Washington to play for Nixon's inauguration in 68, I guess. And Squirrel wasn't there. He was retired by then, and he spent probably half the year in Spain. And I had told him that that Eddie was going to do this, and he said, well, you know where the keys are, just use the place. And I mean, Phyllis was there, Eddie was there, Bill Davison was there, I was there, Marilyn was there. We could have each had our own apartment. I mean, he had 4 in 1, and had this enormous double living room with a piano at one end, and lots of good paintings and stuff like that. But on one wall was 3 very large bookcases, and I looked at the books and things, and I said one day, how are these organized? They don't seem to make any. I mean, like he had all the P.G. Wodehouse books. I mean, he loved that kind of stuff. And I said, how are these organized? And he said, well, this is that, and he said, and this case is for, my friends, and they're all autographed, and I talked to them while they were writing these books and stuff. And it was a rather high-profile group of authors who had written all these things. He knew an awful lot of people and could make a lot of phone calls, and did on my behalf, certainly. And so that's how I got to know him, and we continued that for till he got sick. One of the last things he said to me, he got cancer, and he was being treated at the Cleveland Clinic, and because his second wife, Patter, Mildred Winslow, was from Cleveland. Her family had all the banks in town or something like that. And he said the treatment at the Cleveland Clinic was just incredible. He said they're using this machine and that machine and this and that and the other. He said the only thing that's wrong with it is that they're using them on me. He thought it was funny and fascinating what they were doing, but it was a drag that they were doing it on him. And he didn't make it. But he had a pretty good run. So, lived into his late 70s.